In this interview, I'll be talking to Amanda Bryant, who is a senior analyst with Pembina Institute's oil and gas program and the author of a new report called Unfinished Business. So, welcome to the interview, Amanda.
Thanks, Markham. Thanks for having me.
We're going to be talking about methane emissions from abandoned wells. Uh, and when I say abandoned, that's actually not accurate because there are various categories of wells, but these are non-producing wells. And why don't you give us a little overview of the report, please?
Yeah, happy to. So as you say, there's often a lot of terminological confusion just because terms are used in different ways in different jurisdictions, sometimes in inconsistent ways. So as you say, it's a report about non-producing wells, which just means they're not active. So they're not actively producing or supporting production. And that can include several different categories of wells. So that includes inactive, suspended, properly abandoned. So wells that, by the definitions in Western Canada have been plugged. Sometimes they've been fully decommissioned, cut, capped, and buried. Orphan wells, reclaimed wells. So it's a really broad category of wells. But basically, we were interested in looking at what the official data that the regulators have and the sort of best-in-class scientific studies, what they say about the problem of methane emissions from those wells. So that could be in the form of surface emissions or subsurface leaks. We basically wanted to get a sense of kind of the environmental risks and harms associated with that very broad category of wells. And so from looking at that, all of that data, we found that the problem is actually far more significant than has been recognized previously, and really needs some kind of common sense policy solutions to actually ensure that the risks are properly managed and that companies pay to address kind of closure and cleanup of those wells.
This is the big issue, isn't it? I mean, there are literally hundreds of thousands of wells. I know there's 475,000 in Alberta, which is the big producer. BC produces about half as much as Alberta, so you have to think that they've got a big problem as well. Saskatchewan, much less. So it's really a BC and Alberta problem. Um, the and the big issue here is the industry really doesn't want to clean up its problems. It doesn't want to pay to clean up its problems. And what kind of policy recommendations is Pembina making to get them to clean up their these the emissions?
Right. So uh, I would start off by saying that industry sort of tacitly agreed to pay to clean up the problem as part of the obligations that they took on when, as it's part of the agreement when they it was part of the deal, as it were, when they were allowed to develop the resources of the land, right? So the deal was you get to profit from developing the resources of the land, but of course, at the end of the day, you need to uh, pay to clean up after yourself. And that's just basic responsibility, right? And Albertans and Canadians understand that. It's not particularly controversial. So in terms of the policy recommendations that we'd like to make, many of them are sort of based on the kind of scientific studies, and we tried to make them as kind of evidence-based as possible and pragmatic as possible. But the number one important thing is that there need to be disincentives to actually leaving wells kind of in limbo. So in those different well statuses, somewhere between active and between fully abandoned and reclaimed. So in those kind of idle states or suspended states, because we found in our study that many wells are left in those inactive and suspended states for years or decades. So that's the first thing, Markham, is to actually disincentivize leaving them in those inactive and suspended states. And that can be through various policy tools, things like regulated closure timelines, which we don't have now, idle well fees. Happy to discuss other policy options, but there need to be disincentives.
We need to provide a little historical incentive here because the first Alberta regulator was set up in 1938, and from the very, very beginning, there was recognized that the industry had to clean up. When it had to clean up was entirely different. There has never been a timeline, a mandated timeline in the regulations for when a well had to be fully reclaimed. And like you said, many of those wells have sat there for decades and decades. And we should acknowledge, and this is hotly debated within the industry. The industry doesn't like to hear this, but it has a history of liability dumping. Big companies dump their old, tired out wells that need reclaiming. They dump them onto smaller companies, which dump them onto smaller companies, and eventually some other one of those companies goes bankrupt, and the wells just sit there. And the I'll make a final point here because this is really important. In 1993, the regulator, because there was pressure to fix this problem, there were 25,000 suspended wells at that time in Alberta, and the regulator at the time came to industry and said, "We want you to be not the first one. You know, if you sold a well, fair enough. That owner should clean it up. But if they go bankrupt, we want you to take it over." And the industry said, "No way, we're not, once we've sold a well, sorry, we're not doing that." And the compromise was the Orphan Well Fund. And the industry said, "We will pay for all the wells that kind of get thrown into but there's nobody left to clean it up." And as far as I'm concerned, and I know you talked to people like Mark Doran and Dwight Popovich in the Pollution Pay Federation, and they're adamant about this, is that industry is on the hook for every well that needs to be reclaimed, not the taxpayer.
Right. Right. And so that's really non-negotiable. And as I was saying, it's not particularly controversial. Like, oh, we've done polling and over 90% of Albertans believe in what we sometimes call the polluter pays principle. But it really is just basic to fundamental responsibility, right? And to responsible resource development, which is especially important in this context. These days we're talking about nation building, we're talking about potential pipelines, we're talking about that contentious phrase from Carney's of decarbonized barrels. Well, what does all that mean? What is responsible resource development? Part of it has to mean taking responsibility for closure and cleanup.
Yeah, agreed. So, but there's some language in your report that talks about broad agreement between governments, regulators, and the industry that wells at the end of their life need to be remediated. And I would argue, and this is not again a popular opinion in Alberta, that in fact there is a wink and a nudge agreement. And I interviewed Dan. He was the head of COSIA back in 2012 when it was created. It'll come to me. Dan Wicklum, and he told me that when he sat with the CEOs and they described how they allocate capital. So all the departments within an oil company or a gas company come and say, "We want for exploration," or whatever. And liability comes and they said, what's the return on reclaiming an old well, a tired out well? Was nothing. There's no return on that capital. It's an expense. And they said, "Nope, we're not going to do that." So his point was that they will not allocate capital these days to anything that doesn't have a positive return unless they're mandated by government. There is, so I, that's the only way this is going to happen. The government has to tell the regulator, and the regulator has to enforce it with the companies. And I don't see any other way for this to work.
Yeah. So what I would say is that this is absolutely a problem that needs a strong regulatory hand, and we need to think as a province about what the proper role of a regulator is. And is it a technical aid to industry, or is it there to regulate and to enforce regulation and to protect the public interest? And I would say very much the latter. And so ensuring that this population of wells is actually properly managed, that the environmental risks and harms, and by association, the health and safety risks and harms are properly managed is part of the role of a regulator. And of course, in Alberta, for the regulator to act, they need political direction. And so it's also up to the government to be giving that political direction.
What about the health issues? Because this is not something we talk about a lot, but I know, I've anecdotally, I've interviewed landowners whose health they feel has been affected by leaking wells on their property. it's a difficult one to pin down. But
Right.
there is a sense out there amongst the industry that that is a problem. We don't know how big the problem is. What's your take on that?
So there are the way that I typically put it is that there are associated health impacts from methane emissions from both active production and from non-producing wells, and those need to be well studied and well characterized. But there is an association, and so the main issue is that there are copollutants that come along for the ride with methane. So methane itself, unless you're in an enclosed space and you've got concerns around asphyxiation or explosions, um, inhaling sort of low concentrations of methane is not going to affect you. But the copollutants that are associated with methane can be very, very noxious and harmful. So those include things like hydrogen sulfide or sour gas. That's the thing that will give the kind of the sour rotten egg smell. And if you're smelling that, you need to immediately vacate the area because it can be fatal at high concentrations. At lower concentrations, chronic exposures are going to, people are going to be dealing with headaches, dizziness, respiratory issues, kind of burning eyes, burning throat, and those sorts of symptoms. And then there are other copollutants. Sometimes you get volatile organic compounds that are co-emitted. So that would include things like benzene potentially, and those over chronic exposure over long periods of time would be potentially cancer causing. And so, yes, there are very serious, as I say, associated health consequences of living near an old well that's emitting because it's emitting methane and it's emitting other things too.
Amanda, my last question for you, and that is, what does it look like over the next year or two, maybe even 5 years at the most? But look out and tell us, are we going to see change? Is this issue actually going to be addressed at some point?
So I think we need to think about creating momentum for change, right? And so that's a matter. So the government and the regulator have been aware of this issue for decades, right? And so landowners are rightly frustrated that their concerns haven't historically been meaningfully addressed, and different policy packages have been introduced to deal with the problem in one way or another. Has any of them really been truly effective or really protected the polluter pays principle? Arguably not. And of course, we now have a considered policy, the mature asset strategy, that's under contemplation. There's various ideas in there that are under contemplation. It's not clear which ones will make it to legislation. But the important thing I think is that so the question is how do we get change in Alberta and in the other producing regions of Canada, and how do we actually get the problem to be addressed? And I think it's about a variety of stakeholders making it clear that this is non-negotiable for them, and this is something they're willing to use their vote with, and that this is something that's very important to them. So landowners, yes, but also other citizens and potentially some of the most powerful voices in this province are industry voices. So if tech and service providers, if there are kind of proactive leaders in the industry that can speak to the importance of resolving the problem, that would be probably the most powerful tool.
Well, Amanda, thank you very much for this. Hopefully, Alberta and BC can build enough political momentum that this gets addressed. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Markham.